Now, this section of our presentation is going to change, and we are going to focus on the components that are usually found in Chapter 1 of a dissertation or a master's thesis proposal. And we're very blessed to know that the material presented in this presentation on this slide is very typical of what you're going to see in extension education, agricultural communications, agricultural education, or family and consumer science education. But I do want you to understand one little thing, okay? I do need you to understand that the material will be presented in this order, but it's not always going to be the exact items on the slide. So for example, as a committee, I usually don't include a section on the methodology in Chapter 1 because Chapter 3 goes through an elaborate section on methodology. Some professors will group the limitations and the delimitations together rather than having them separate. Others will not have a summary at the end of the section. And so it really depends on your committee. It's best just to talk to your committee chair, make sure that you know what components are expected of you, and then you write those components so that it is easy to go through the process and know that you're not missing anything prior to the thesis defense and the proposal defense. For the background and the setting, this section is really intended to help answer the question, what special factors were at work that might possibly have influenced the conceptualization of your study. So ordinarily, the background section can take 2 to 5 pages. It just depends upon the nature of your study and the approach to your writing. You might deal with special background factors such as the societal background, so the develops and changes in society that have made your problem seem important. Or intellectual background, so that would be the major intellectual and philosophical movements at the time that have provide context for your study. The professional background, which are the developments in your field that have made this problem worth studying. Or the research background, which means that there's new methods or theories that need to be tested, or maybe gaps in existing knowledge that you could study. But your background and setting lead to your problem statement. So the problem statement is going to be your succinct statement of the problem that you're investigating. It will answer that what is being done in this study. This is to make sure that you're answering answers to the problem will actually lead to the data that you need to obtain through the instrument you develop and the methodology that you are using in your study. You need to pick a problem that you have a genuine professional interest in, but maybe one that you don't have a personal interest in, just because if you're out there to prove something, and such emotional ties tend to be a blind spot for the researcher from the resulting data, and can be really hard to draw conclusions and make recommendations because you're so narrowly focused on something you don't look at it in an objective perspective. We also need a section that addresses your objectives. And this is best located after a statement of the problem because it's going to indicate what data you're actually going to collect. And you can have research hypotheses, you can have research questions, or you can have research objectives. And one thing I do want to make sure you understand are that there is an order for whether you use research objectives, whether you use research questions, or you use hypotheses. And so research objectives are very clear, succinct statements telling what you're going to find. A research question is an open-ended question that you're going to research, learn more about, and then write the results for. And then a hypothesis is an actual prediction that's between 2 or more variables. And you have to make sure that your objectives, hypotheses, or your research questions relate back to your literature and the theoretical framework or conceptual framework you're using in Chapter 2. So if you are doing a survey, correlational research or a qualitative research study, it would be appropriate to use either research questions or research objectives. But if you're doing an ex post facto study or an experimental design, you need to write hypotheses. It is common to see at least 2 or 3 research objectives, questions, or hypotheses, sometimes more, but they are typically written in a numbered list so that they can be clearly identified later in Chapter 3, as well as for Chapter 4 when you write the results for each of those items. And these objectives, research questions, or hypotheses really influence the decisions you make about running your project. What population are you going to study? What's your sample? What data collection methods are you using? How are you going to analyze your data? So if you don't have really well-written research objectives, research questions, or hypotheses to help guide your study, you're going to struggle. Examples. So in survey methodology, you'll frequently see research objectives, and they tend to start with an active verb in present tense. So evaluate respondents' existing attitudes toward the U.S. agriculture industry and food-related public organizations. And then the data that you're collecting in the survey are going to ask them about their attitudes, and then toward the agriculture industry, and then toward public organizations related to food. In this example, we have a hypothesis. And so if they're doing an online survey, there are times when it's appropriate to do an hypothesis. And in this one, you might look at all of the literature that you have in Chapter 2, and then your problem that you're studying and the significance of it, and then you make a prediction. This is a hypothesis that with the data you collect after you analyzing it, you're going to be able to either accept this hypothesis or reject this hypothesis. And it's usually a very straightforward statement. So it'll tell you agricultural producers in the Southern Plains region climate hub will fall in the audience segment groups of the concerned and the cautious, as identified in the Six Americas study. So through this survey, by asking several different sections of questions, this researcher will be able to predict whether or not the sample in the study actually falls into one of those segment groups. And if so, why? And if not, why? And is this hypothesis accepted or was it rejected? And so that's one way you can do it. You don't always have to have hypotheses with experimental designs. I do need to make that sure. Even though it's often used for prediction and you think of an experimental design, you can use a survey in experimental research. It just depends on how it's administered. So one thing I want you to remember is that you might come across a few errors. For example, I will see students mix between research questions and research objectives when writing their thesis proposal. It's either one or the other. You don't mix them up, and it needs to be one single list. I also see a concern when students will look at the purpose of their study and make that the research objective, and you can't do that. You can have your problem statement, a little purpose statement, and then the research objectives or questions, but you can't mush it all into one single paragraph. It needs to be in sections. Methodology is an optional section that may contain a very brief outline of 3 things: the participants in your research study, the instrumentation used to collect your data, and then the procedure that would be followed. Now, all of these elements will be reported in detail in Chapter 3, but you might want to just preview them for your readers so they have a better understanding of what to look forward to, since the Chapter 1 is really an introduction to the study. The limitations are limitations that the researcher has no control over. These limitations might include resources for your topic, which are limiting you from doing a more extensive study. It might be subjects who fail to complete the appropriate test items. It might be factors that would cause you to eliminate a participant from a study. And this section may not be applicable to your topic, so I suggest you seek advice from your committee chair as to whether or not you will have limitations. But I tend to find limitations with the population and the sample I use, limitations with maybe the way the data has to be collected or the time frame of the study, and even budgets that can affect how you can go about collecting the data. Basic assumptions are things that you're taking for granted. They're self-evident truths. So in a qualitative study, it might be assumed that all the participants are qualified individuals that you've contacted because of their knowledge of the topic. It could also be assumed that in survey methodology, your participants will answer truthfully and accurately to the questions asked, and that they'll respond to the best of their ability, and that they're actually the individual responding rather than somebody else. You will typically state your assumptions in a series of numbered sentences, as brief as possible, so that what is assumed is clear. And in the statement of an assumption, consider stating the reason why something might be the case or why it's not necessarily an assumption. If there is a reason for believing an assumption is true, I would state that reason. Sometimes I find it easier to write this section later as I'm developing my methodology in Chapter 3, because I'll discover assumptions about the participants and the methodology I'm using that would help me write Chapter 1 section. Delimitations are items that are deliberately controlled by the researcher. The delimitation section just establishes the limits or the perimeters that you're choosing to use. So in a delimitations in a social science study would be such things as the school district where the study took place, the number of repetitions you could complete in an experiment, the population that you're sampling, the selection criteria, the demographic variables you've chosen to report. So the delimitation section should not be confused with the limitation section. Those factors are something that the individuals have no control over. But in this situation, you have complete control over it, and they're deliberately done. And you may find that writers will refer to this section as a scope of the study. Now, the purpose and the significance of the prompt section is to explain, why did you bother to conduct this study? So in answering this question, your tone is very important. You don't want to claim too much. You want to make sure that you're very specific about the need or the significance of the study, indicating by careful analysis that this study is important from more than maybe one point of view. How will it contribute to the knowledge needed? How will it help professionals in their job? Or how does it add to the theory that you're using to study? So the significance is addressed by discussing how the study adds to that theoretical body of knowledge in the field, and the study's practical significance to the professionals in the field being examined. Grounds for this research can come from expert opinions who call on investigations of problems. It can be from emerging questions of prior studies or conflicting findings in other studies, the evolution of methodologies, or maybe political, social, or psychological trends that we're seeing in our country. You may see them written as if-then statements. So if this happens, and this will be the result. And that can be a very nice hypothetical deductive logic provided in your writing. An introductory sentence usually sets up the definition of key terms for your study. And the terms in this section should be terms directly related to your research that are going to be used throughout your study. And it's up to you as the researcher to define these terms as you want the readers to know them. So you can define your terms from a dictionary or a professional reference source. It's often going to be the case that scholars you reference will have developed their own definition, and you can cite that definition, but you could also just review a variety of definitions that have surfaced in the literature review and then synthesize your own definition, showing why it's more appropriate than the other definitions. So for example, in my research, I frequently will define attitude, how I define knowledge, how I define behaviors, intentions to perform a behavior, the individuals who influence them, subjective norms. I'll define the theory that I'm researching, and then key terms that I see in the study that would be helpful for the readers to know. Because the manuscript is targeted to the academic audience, it's unnecessary for you to have an exhaustive list of terms that a lay audience would not understand. So you need to keep the academic audience in mind and review that list with your advisor and your committee members to decide the appropriate terms to include in this section. But I do expect my students to come with me to me with a list of terms defined, and then we will add and modify and change that list as is needed in our writing process. I would encourage you to think about all the variables in your research hypotheses, your questions, your objectives, and your statement problems. Define any attributes of your population that are really important. Define your theories or your models that you're referring to, just to make sure everybody's on the same page and are thinking about those terms in the same way you are when reading the document. And then lastly, the summary section of Chapter 1 is optional, but it allows you to focus on a synthesis of topics without repeating verbatim what was actually covered in this chapter. It's helpful for readers who are unfamiliar with the content area just to superficially examine the material in this chapter. So if you present it in a very clear-cut 1 or 2 paragraphs, that does help with their knowledge and understanding. Then you could provide a 1-paragraph description of how the remainder of the study is organized. So you can discuss chapters 2 through 5 and any appendices that you know you're going to include. And then for a proposal, you might only refer to chapter 2 and chapter 3. This section closes with statements of what to expect in the review of literature and in the methodology. It is considered optional by many committees. However, to be consistent, if you do a summary in your first chapter, then a summary should appear at the end of every chapter. I want to thank you for your time, and if you have any questions or comments about the structure of a thesis proposal, and particularly the components of Chapter 1, please contact me at kelsey.hall@usu.edu or through Canvas inbox. Thank you.